Welcome to the deep dive. We're not just about surface level stuff here. We like to really get into it, pull things apart.
Exactly.
And today we've got a really fundamental question on the table. Is the news you see, well, is it just a plain reflection of what's happening, a mirror on reality?
Or is it something? Well, something built, something constructed, maybe shaped by forces we don't always see.
That's the core of it. Our mission today isn't just, scrolling through headlines. It's about understanding where our news actually comes from, what influences what we end up reading, watching, hearing. We're going to dig into this tension. The idea of journalists giving us an objective window on the world.
Versus the view that news is socially constructed, shaped by all sorts of powerful players.
Yeah, and the sources we've dug into offer this really fascinating sociological take. Lots of insights, examples. I think it'll definitely make you look at the news in a new light.
It really should.
So let's dive in.
Okay.
First off, think about the traditional journalist's perspective. Many see their job as, well, fundamentally objective.
Right.
They follow these things called news values, basically. Criteria for deciding what's actually news.
What makes the cut?
Exactly. Now, they'd probably admit, sure, the way The Sun covers a story is different from how Channel 4 News does it. Different styles, different angles.
Of course. Different organizations have their house style, their focus.
But the underlying belief, for many of them, is still about presenting the facts, aiming for objectivity.
But then you get the critical perspective, which flips that completely.
Right.
They argue news is far from objective. It's deeply socially constructed. And this isn't random. It's shaped, often quite deliberately, by powerful groups.
Like who?
Media owners, politicians, big PR firms.
Yeah.
They all have a hand in it.
And the concern there is?
Well, the worry is this construction leads to news that feels kind of bland, maybe uniform. It can squeeze out alternative views, dissenting voices.
So it ends up reinforcing a certain worldview.
Precisely. It can function almost like an ideology of the powerful, subtly pushing particular ways of thinking, making them seem like common sense.
Okay, so that sets up the big question for you listening. Based on the news you see every day, which view feels more real? Are you looking through a clear window?
Or does it feel more like you're seeing a reality that's been, well, put together, carefully framed?
Something to mull over. And adding to this complexity is how much the sources of news have changed.
Oh, dramatically. Think back, say, before the 1990s. It was simpler, wasn't it?
Yeah, newspapers, radio, the main TV channels, pretty straightforward.
That was dominant. But the 21st century, it just opened the floodgates. You got 24-hour rolling news, Sky News, CNN.
Online news sites exploded, Huffington Post, BuzzFeed News later on.
Social media, obviously Facebook, Twitter, now X. They became major news conduits.
And blogs. Don't forget blogs. Suddenly anyone could publish.
You're right. But here's a fascinating twist. An Ofcom report from 2014, so a decade ago now, but still indicative.
What did it find?
Even with all these new options, guess what the most used platform for news was?
Still television.
By a long shot. 75% of people.
Wow. So much for the digital revolution wiping everything out overnight.
Exactly. Newspapers were next at 40%, then radio at 36%. Old habits die hard, it seems.
Yeah, that's really sticky.
But there's a clear trend, especially with younger people. Newspaper reading was definitely declining.
I remember that being a big story.
In that same 2014 report, only about a third, 33% of 16 to 24-year-olds were reading physical papers.
Where were they getting news?
The internet. 60% were using the internet and apps, especially on their phones. Smartphones were becoming the go-to device.
But here's another interesting layer, something Benson pointed out around 2010. Just because people use new media, like websites or apps,
Doesn't mean they're getting radically different news.
exactly. Many people were, and still are, accessing the websites of the traditional news gatherers. The BBC's website, for instance, was hugely popular online even then.
So it's more like new delivery mechanisms for the established players in many cases.
Right. New platforms, often for the same old sources.
And this ties into trust levels, which is also quite revealing.
How so?
Well, Ofcom surveys consistently showed that most people in the UK trusted television news the most. They tended to see it as that, accurate and trustworthy window on the world.
Okay, so TV news seen as quite objective.
Generally, yes. But newspaper readers, they were often much more aware of their chosen paper's leanings.
They knew if they were reading a Labour or Tory paper, basically.
Pretty much. They recognized the political slant, the ideological bias, much more openly acknowledged.
So it's a real mix of perceived objectivity and acknowledged bias, depending on the medium. Makes you think about your own news habits, doesn't it?
Definitely. What do you rely on? How much do you trust it?
So let's get into the how. How is news actually made?
Well, McQuail made a key point back in '92.
Mm.
Not everything that happens becomes news, right?
Obviously not. There's too much happening.
Exactly. So news, he said, is a socially manufactured product. It's the result of choices, a selective process, and the people making those choices. Gatekeepers, editors, journalists,
Yeah.
the people deciding what gets in and what stays out. Precisely. And media sociologists tend to highlight three big areas of influence on this process.
Okay, what are they?
First, these news values, we touched on the sort of built-in criteria for what makes a good story.
Right. Second.
Second, the practical stuff, organizational or bureaucratic constraints, the day-to-day realities of the newsroom.
Budgets, deadlines, things like that.
Exactly. And third, a really big one, the ownership of media news organizations. Who actually controls the outlets?
Okay, three key areas. Let's unpack the first one. News values, what exactly are they?
Spencer Thomas described them as the criteria that decide how important a story is, how prominent it should be.
How high up the bulletin, how big the headline.
Yeah. And Bright and Foy called them something like intangible, informal, almost unconscious elements. Things journalists just know make a story work.
Instinctive, almost.
Kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who take a pluralist view, seeing news as a diverse marketplace, the alternatives are vital for survival.
Why is that?
Commercial pressure. News outlets need eyeballs to get advertising money. So they pick stories based on values they think will grab an audience. It's a business decision, partly.
Okay, so let's get specific. Galtung and Rouge did this famous study way back, identifying key news values, still very relevant. Let's run through some.
Good idea.
First, extraordinariness. Stuff that's rare, surprising.
The classic, man bites dog, not dog bites man.
Exactly. Then threshold, basically size matters.
The bigger the event, more people affected, more money involved, the more newsworthy.
Makes sense. Unambiguity. Stories that are simple, easy to understand.
Yeah, complexity doesn't always play well, especially on TV news, perhaps.
Reference to elite persons. If it involves famous or powerful people, it's automatically more interesting, right?
Absolutely. Celebrity news is a huge driver. Politics, too.
Reference to elite nations. We tend to hear more about countries culturally similar to our own.
Cultural proximity, yeah. Events in the U.S. or Western Europe often get more coverage than, say, parts of Africa or Asia, unfortunately.
Personalization. Linking events to individuals makes them more relatable.
Putting a human face on a story, very common tactic.
Frequency. Events that happen suddenly and fit the news cycle.
A plane crash, a sudden political resignation, they fit neatly into a 24-hour cycle. Slow-burning issues, harder to cover sometimes.
Continuity. Once a story is running, it keeps running.
Yeah, the ongoing saga effect. Think of a major trial or a developing political crisis.
Negativity. This is a big one. Bad news sells.
Seems to, yeah. Conflict, disaster, scandal, they often get top billing. Seen as more exciting, maybe. Draws a bigger crowd.
And finally, composition. Editors try to balance the news agenda.
Right. If it's all doom and gloom or all foreign news, they might slot in something lighter or domestic just for variety. Mix it up a bit.
That's a comprehensive list.
And it's evolved. Researchers like Harkup and O'Neill added things relevant to British news like celebrity, entertainment, even the media agenda itself. Stories become news just because everyone else is covering them.
Keeping up with the competition.
And practical things too, like do we have pictures? Can we make it sensational? That influences choices.
But these values aren't set in stone, and they've got critics.
Definitely. Brighton and Foy, for example, questioned whether there's really a universal consensus on newsworthiness. It probably varies a lot.
And internationally, too, right? What's big news here might not be elsewhere.
Exactly. Cultural differences matter. Plus, some argue these traditional values are less powerful now.
Why is that?
Because of things like spin doctors managing the news flow, churnalism, which we'll get to, and citizen journalists bypassing the traditional gates altogether.
It complicates the picture. So, a challenge for you listening, next time you watch or read the news, try to spot these values. Which ones are making that story prominent?
It's a useful exercise.
Okay, so beyond these inherent news values, what else shapes the news? You mentioned powerful groups trying to influence things.
Yes, absolutely. Take spin doctors. This is a well-known phenomenon, particularly in politics.
People whose job it is to manage the message.
Precisely. Government ministers, their advisors, PR professionals. They feed stories, information, quotes directly to political reporters, often part of the lobby system.
And the goal?
To manage the narrative, to put a positive spin on things, ensure stories land favorably for the government or their client. It clearly challenges the idea that news just emerges objectively from events and values. It's being actively shaped, managed.
And that links to this idea of churnalism, doesn't it?
It does. Nick Davies wrote extensively about this. The argument is, because newsrooms are facing budget cuts, fewer journalists, more pressure.
They don't have time for original reporting.
Often, no. So many journalists end up becoming passive processors of information. They rely heavily on unchecked, secondhand material.
Where does it come from?
Wire services like the Press Association, PR companies pumping out press releases. That material gets repackaged, maybe slightly rewritten, and pushed out as news.
So less investigation, more churning out content.
That's the idea behind the term churnalism. And Phillips noted how this leads to stories being rewritten from other outlets, often without saying where they came from.
Which means
you get this sense of uniformity across different news sources. Everyone's running similar stories based on the same limited pool of original, often PR-driven information. It reduces real choice for the audience.
it sounds quite efficient, but maybe not great for journalism.
That's the concern. And then throwing another spanner in the works, you have citizen journalism.
This is where anyone can be a reporter, right? Using their phone, social media.
Exactly. The internet, smartphones, social networks allow ordinary people to capture and share stories, photos, videos. Sometimes this stuff goes viral. Sometimes mainstream news outlets pick it up.
What's the argument for it?
Well, people like Matt Drudge claimed it empowers every citizen to report, free from the constraints of traditional news values. It's seen as potentially more democratic. Supporters point to its whistleblowing potential, exposing things authorities might want hidden, and its ability to show events in places traditional journalists can't easily reach. Think of the Arab Spring uprisings, where citizen footage was crucial.
But it's not without problems.
Oh, definitely not. Critics like Andrew Keene have been quite scathing, calling it opinion as fact, rumor as reportage.
Lacking accuracy and verification.
That's the main charge. Others have studied it and found actually it hasn't had a massive impact on how professional news is gathered day to day.
Interesting.
And Gilmore raised a really important point about who actually does citizen journalism. It often comes from a pretty narrow and privileged part of society.
Why is that?
You need the education, the tech skills, the money for the devices, and crucially, the time to do it. It's not equally accessible to everyone.
So it's a mixed bag. A question for you then. Have you ever consumed news that, looking back, might have been journalism? Hard to tell sometimes, isn't it?
Very hard.
And what do you think are the real benefits and drawbacks of citizen journalism today? It's everywhere now.
It really is. Okay, let's move inside the news organization itself. The internal processes, the routines, they matter too.
These are the organizational or bureaucratic routines.
That's right. And a massive one is simply financial costs.
News isn't cheap to make.
Not at all. Proper news gathering, especially investigations or foreign reporting, is incredibly expensive. Sending crews, paying reporters, insurance, it adds up.
So budget cuts have a real impact.
A huge impact.
Yeah.
It often means less of that expensive investigative work, fewer foreign correspondents, what sometimes fills the gap.
Cheaper content.
Yeah, like focusing more on celebrity stories, digging up dirt, things that cost less but still grab attention. Williams noted this trend.
Franklin called this shift infotainment, right?
Yes, that blend of information and entertainment, it definitely attracts audiences, which is good for business.
But the downside.
It blurs the lines between fact and fiction, serious issues, and trivial ones. Some argue it dumbs down public debate and could even be a threat to, culture and democracy if entertainment completely replaces substance.
A serious charge. What other routines matter?
Simple things like time or space available. News have to fit the slot.
A 30-minute TV bulletin versus a thick newspaper.
Exactly. TV news often needs shorter, punchier items. Newspapers might have space for more in-depth analysis, though that's changing too with online formats.
And deadlines. They must drive everything.
Absolutely, especially for newspapers with fixed print deadlines. 24-hour news channels have an edge here. They can run with breaking news instantly.
Which leads to immediacy and actuality.
Right. There's a definite preference for events you can show happening now. Live footage, sound bites, they add that sense of dramatic reality.
Technology makes this easier than ever.
For sure. Live streams, instant updates on apps, it feeds that demand for immediacy. Breaking news is constant.
So the very structure and constraints of the newsroom shape the output.
Absolutely. Logistics matter.
What about the audience? Do we influence the news?
Pluralists would definitely say yes. They argue news outlets tailor content to their specific target audience.
Makes sense. You wouldn't expect the Financial Times and a teen magazine to cover things the same way.
Exactly. They consider the audience's assumed interests, education level, political leanings. Even the time of day matters. The main evening news might select more important stories than a daytime bulletin.
So we, the consumers, are part of the equation.
Definitely. Which brings us, perhaps uncomfortably, to journalistic ethics.
Ah, this can get messy.
It can. Keeble and Mayer, among others, have highlighted various unethical practices over the years. For a long time, the UK press was self-regulated by the Press Complaints Commission, the PCC.
But it was voluntary, right? Lacked real teeth.
That was the criticism, yes. It operated with a code of conduct, but its power to actually punish breaches was limited.
And then came the big one, the phone hacking scandal in 2011.
Yes, involving News International. The revelation that journalists had hacked into voicemails. Most disturbingly, the voicemail of the murdered schoolgirl, Millie Dowler. That caused a huge public outcry.
It felt like a real turning point. Led to the Leveson inquiry.
It did, a major public inquiry into the culture, practices, and ethics of the press.
What did Leveson recommend?
A key recommendation was for a new, independent regulatory body, but one underpinned by legislation giving it real teeth, including the power to impose fines.
And did that happen?
Not really. The government at the time rejected most of the core recommendations, particularly the legislative underpinning. They introduced a different watchdog, but many major news organizations refused to sign up to it.
So the debate over press regulation continues.
Very much so. It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How much is the news shaped not just by external forces, but maybe by what the media thinks we want? Or even by what we actually demand, ethically or not?
A tricky question. Let's shift focus now to ownership and ideology. This feels like a really critical area.
It is. And again, you have different perspectives. The pluralist view often portrays journalists as, objective truth seekers.
News values are seen as apolitical, impartial guides in that view.
Largely, yes.
Yeah.
They focus on professionalism and the diversity of outlets ensuring a range of views overall.
Okay, but then comes the Marxist critique. What's their take?
It's fundamentally different. McChesney, for example, called journalistic objectivity an ideological myth.
Strong words. Why?
They argue that the people who own the major media outlets have a massive influence on how news is socially manufactured.
How does that work? Do owners dictate every story?
Not necessarily day-to-day interference, though that can happen. It's more about setting the overall editorial direction, the general slant, the boundaries of acceptable debate. McChesney pointed to the lack of coverage in Murdoch's papers about his own contacts with Tony Blair before the Iraq War as a potential example.
So the owner's interests shape the framework.
That's the argument. Herman and Chomsky developed this further with their propaganda model. They argued news is shaped by market forces and a series of filters.
Filters? What kind of filters?
Things like ownership, profit motive, reliance on advertising revenue, sourcing, relying on official sources, flack, negative responses to critical reporting, and anti-communism, or nowadays, perhaps anti-other ideologies. These filters, they argued, ensure news generally supports the status quo, particularly capitalist ideology.
So news organizations, being profit-driven businesses, inherently biases the content.
That's a core part of their argument. Being reliant on advertisers means you're unlikely to run content that seriously alienates those advertisers or the consumer culture they promote. The result, they suggest, is news that tends to lean towards neoliberal, politically conservative views.
And McChesney also observed who gets treated as credible.
Yes.
Huh.
Official sources, big business, government officials are generally seen as legitimate, their voices prioritized.
Well, others.
The poor, the powerless activists challenging the system, often portrayed as less reliable, more biased, or simply ignored. Magdikian made a similar point about how capitalist values just permeate news coverage. Lots of uncritical reporting on business deals.
But less on the economic pressures facing ordinary people.
Exactly. Or Edwards and Cromwell, who went further, suggesting the media sometimes acts as a propaganda machine for capitalism, actively ignoring things like corporate crime or human rights abuses committed by allies of the UK or US.
It's a powerful critique. What about other critical perspectives?
Well, there's the concept of the hierarchy of credibility, often associated with neo-Marxists like Stuart Hall.
How does that differ?
It also argues news tends to support capitalist interests, but focuses more on access and status. Powerful groups simply have better, easier access to journalists and the media machine.
So their voices get heard more easily.
Yes. Journalists tend to rank the views of primary definers, politicians, police chiefs, business leaders, as inherently more credible, more newsworthy than, say, trade union leaders, protesters, or ordinary people affected by a policy.
So journalists report what these primary definers say about an event rather than just the event itself.
Often, yes. The official perspective becomes the dominant frame. And groups that challenge that frame, they're often ignored or portrayed negatively, marginalized.
Okay, and then there's the Glasgow University Media Group, GUMG. What was their contribution?
Their approach, sometimes called hegemonic Marxist, focused on the background of media professionals.
Journalists and editors themselves.
Exactly. They pointed out that most senior journalists and editors come from relatively privileged middle-class backgrounds.
And that matters because
Because it shapes their worldview, their assumptions, their common sense. They argued these professionals unconsciously side with the powerful because they share similar perspectives. This isn't necessarily conspiracy, but a result of shared backgrounds and values.
So it leads to agenda setting, deciding what's important based on their own worldview.
Precisely. They include stories that fit their understanding of the world and exclude or downplay those that don't. The GUMG did detailed studies, particularly on industrial disputes, finding the language and images used were consistently more sympathetic to employers and the government than to striking workers.
And they continued this work.
Yes, later GUMG research used a more nuanced circuit of communication model, looking at the whole complex flow of information between institutions, the media, the public, and policymakers.
These are all quite strong critiques suggesting significant bias. Are there counter-arguments?
Oh, absolutely. Schlesinger, for instance, argued that the media doesn't always act in the interests of the powerful. There are times they investigate corporations or challenge government policy.
And competition.
Right. The intense competition between news outlets arguably undermines the idea of a single, unified, capitalist propaganda message. They're trying to scoop each other, find different angles.
Any other criticisms?
Feminists have also critiqued these Marxist theories for often overlooking gender, for failing to adequately analyze how women are represented or misrepresented or ignored in the news.
So it's complex. Looking at ownership and ideology really forces you to question the idea of neutrality, doesn't it? Does hearing this make you think differently about your go-to news source and its potential biases?
It certainly should prompt reflection.
Okay, let's wrap up the main content with one more really interesting and sometimes troubling concept. Moral panics.
Ah, yes. Stanley Cohen's work. Still incredibly relevant.
So what is a moral panic in simple terms?
It's basically when the media, and sometimes politicians or other influential figures, fixate on a particular group or activity. They define it as a serious threat to society, often blowing the actual danger way out of proportion.
Creating anxiety and fear.
Exactly. Generating public anxiety, which then puts pressure on authorities, the police, the government, to be seen to be doing something, to control the problem.
Cohen studied this directly, didn't he? The mods and rockers back in the 60s?
That's the classic study. He looked at media coverage of some seaside clashes between these youth groups in 1964. Objectively, they were relatively minor scuffles.
But the headlines
were things like Day of Terror. The media coverage massively exaggerated the events, portraying these young people as dangerous folk devils, a fundamental threat to decency and order. The panic was largely manufactured by the reporting itself.
So the media didn't just report, it amplified and arguably created the panic.
Precisely. Cohen even identified a kind of predictable cycle, an 8-stage process for how these things often unfold.
What does the cycle look like?
It typically starts with exaggerated, sensationalist reporting. Then comes the demonization of the group involved, the folk devils. Often there's oversimplification, ignoring complexities.
Then others get involved?
Yes. You get reactions from moral entrepreneurs, people who campaign against the perceived threat. This leads to calls for action, often resulting in increased policing or new controls.
And that can backfire.
Sometimes, yes. Increased attention can lead to deviancy amplification. The crackdown makes the group seem more significant, or even pushes them further into the behavior. And finally, the initial prophecy is fulfilled. The problem seems bigger, justifying the initial panic.
Why do these panics happen? What drives them?
Several possibilities. They often align well with those news values, negativity, extraordinariness. Maybe journalists genuinely believe they're reflecting public concern, or assume audiences share their moral outrage.
Or maybe it's just about selling papers.
That's certainly a factor too. Sensationalism sells. fear sells.
And Stuart Hall had a neo-Marxist take on this.
Yes, he analyzed moral panics about black muggers in the 1970s. He argued these panics weren't just random media events, but served capitalist interests.
Most so.
By creating fear and division within the working class, pitting white against black, and crucially, by distracting public attention from deeper economic problems like unemployment caused by capitalist mismanagement, it shifted blame onto a scapegoat group.
A way to manage social crisis. But the theory of moral panics itself has critics now, right?
It does. Jukes, for example, argues the concept can be a bit vague. And importantly, she points out that not all groups labeled folk devils are necessarily unfairly targeted. Her example is pedophiles. Public concern there isn't just a media fabrication.
That's a fair point.
Critcher also found the concept somewhat abstract, the key characteristics hard to pin down objectively. And Jukes also argues we shouldn't underestimate the audience. People aren't just passive dupes. They can often see through ideological veils, recognize exaggeration.
And what about new media? How does that change things?
This is where it gets really interesting. Postmodernists and thinkers like McRobbie and Thornton argue that the sheer diversity of today's media landscape actually undermines traditional moral panics.
How?
Because audiences aren't just getting one dominant message anymore. They're exposed to countless different interpretations and viewpoints online. New media allows marginalized groups to answer back, to contest the narrative. Panics become hotly contested rather than passively accepted. Audiences are seen as more sophisticated.
So new media might actually diffuse moral panics.
That's one argument. But there's a counter-argument, too.
Which is?
Keene, for instance, suggests that interactive new media, especially social media, can actually accelerate moral panics.
By spreading rumors faster.
Exactly. Unsubstantiated rumors, misinformation, outrage. It can spread like wildfire online, potentially whipping up panic even faster and wider than traditional media could. It makes discerning truth harder.
So new media could cut both ways. It really makes you think. Can you recall a recent story that felt like a moral panic? How did platforms like Twitter or TikTok play into it, amplifying it, or maybe providing counter-narratives?
It's a constant dynamic now.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together. What's the big picture from this deep dive?
Well, I think the clearest takeaway is that news isn't just a simple reflection of reality. It's profoundly shaped or socially manufactured, as we've said.
By what forces?
By those internal news values journalists use, by the practical constraints and routines of the newsroom budgets, deadlines, technology.
And crucially, by ownership and ideology.
Yes, the influence of who owns the media and the underlying political and economic viewpoints that often filter through, consciously or not. It frequently ends up reflecting the interests and perspectives of powerful groups.
And sometimes, as we just discussed, the media can even play a central role in constructing these widespread anxieties we call moral panics.
Absolutely. And the arrival of new media hasn't simplified things. It's added whole new layers of complexity.
More voices, potentially more diversity?
Yes, that potential is there.
Yeah.
But also new challenges. Questions about verification, the speed of misinformation, the role of algorithms, citizen journalism's pros and cons. It's a very different landscape for selecting and presenting news.
It really is constantly evolving.
And it demands we pay close attention.
So the final thought to leave you with is this. Knowing all these layers, all these influences, all this potential for construction, what does it actually mean for you to be well-informed today in the 21st century?
And maybe just as importantly, how do you go about verifying the truth, or at least the balance, of the news you consume every day?
Something to definitely think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.